This week in Pure Reinvention.
We're doing this great thing, we're doing this great thing, we're doing this great thing, and then you have a 45-minute conversation where everything that comes out of somebody's mouth is, wouldn't it be great if? Let's stop talking about wouldn't it be great if, and let's just start doing some of that stuff.
Episode 51, Noah Smith, partner at Capital Services and board chairman at Impression 5 Science Center.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this edition of Pure Reinvention, where our mission is to create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. Hi, Misty.
Hello there.
Noah Smith really captured a lot of very cool things, didn't he?
He did. He had a lot to talk about and a lot of experience. You can tell that he's one of those committed leaders to be part of the continual reinvention cycle and see them through to the next step.
Noah took on a very, very important role as the president of the board of directors for a business at a time when it really needed a dedicated leader to help it move on to its next level. And I have absolutely been an admirer of how Noah has done just that and put in motion, taking a business which was just kind of getting by the time this journey is done in this phase, Misty, just in this phase, It will become a regional attraction.
That is so exciting, and how amazing for Noah to kind of, add that on his list of accomplishments. What I liked while listening to him talk was it was pretty clear that he's a natural influencer. I don't know if that's something that he's studied and, had to learn, or if that's just something that emerged in him. But you can tell just from the way he talks that he's very familiar in that space.
That's a really good point, Misty. I think maybe what we begin to identify there is Noah is owning his role in this. I think in his day job as an influencer, he has to be committed and own what he is trying to influence. And I believe in the same way he's taken on his role as the president of the board, he's not just running the agenda. He's not putting little check marks by when we've accomplished things in a board meeting. He's actually owned the journey of having this business reinvent itself.
When you're listening to this, one of the major things is how often Noah reminds us just to ask. Don't be afraid to ask.
I think many times, and I'm not sure, maybe this is something we learned from Mom, Misty, but many times I think maybe we think it's more polite not to ask. But in business, it's all about getting what you need and getting what you ask for. And I don't think it's wrong for a business to expect success. And so in order to expect success, you have to make sure you are positioning itself and you are asking for the right ingredients to make that happen. And Noah has been relentless in looking at all the ingredients, at the board level, at the operational level, to make this business really pop.
Well, I think that it'll be a perfect time to tune into this interview and then come on the other end and see what else we've learned from what Noah has to say.
This is such a great opportunity today to talk to Noah Smith, who is a partner of Capital Services, where their tagline is, "We are your voice." Noah, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Mike.
Noah, we are going to use your voice today, and we're going to ask you a few questions about a little of the work that you've done for being the president of Impression 5 Science Center. But before we get into that, which is really going to be fun, tell us a little bit about you and the work you do here at Capital Services.
Yeah, you bet. So I'm actually a Hazlitt kid. I'm a local boy. Graduated from Hazlitt High School in 1992, and that's going to matter in just a minute. Let's come back to that because that's part of being involved with Impression 5. Did an 8-year stint in the United States Marine Corps. Also got my degree in public administration.
That'd be Semper Fi, right?
Yeah, that'd be Semper Fi. And got my degree from Grand Valley State University in public administration. And then started working here at the Capitol. And there's sort of a natural progression of jobs at the Capitol from up and up in the staff ranks, or you get out and start lobbying. I got out and started lobbying, and of course, Capital Services is a multi-client lobbying firm.
So you have, as your kind of your core background, a interest in helping things move forward.
Absolutely.
And you had gotten in with the Impression 5 Science Center for a reason, and I'm going to guess that has something to do with your earlier comment.
Well, to bring that full circle, the executive director of Impression 5, Eric Larson, is also a Hazelton High School grad. And as happens, local boys run into local boys. I was taking my kids through the museum one afternoon, and I ran into Eric. He and I started talking. And I said, hey, man, if you ever have any space or any need, I'd love to have a seat on your board. I really like the Science Center. I like what's going on here and want to be involved. And STEM and science learning, I think, is something important I want for my kids.
Can you explain a little of why you and I felt there was some work that needed to be done?
Yeah, you bet. So there was kind of two things when I first started getting involved on the board at Impression 5, and please understand that none of these comments are meant to disparage or throw any dirt on the work of prior chairs or any of the prior stuff that went on at Impression 5.
In fact, their work led up to the opportunity for this to happen.
That's absolutely right, and a lot of their work, especially the recent board and the recent chairs leading up to sort of our involvement mutually, Mike, was that it had to get itself out of a bad situation. And what that bad situation ultimately led to was a mindset of always being in survival mode. So the center was always, paycheck to paycheck, how can I survive? How do I keep scrabbling up this cliff and not fall down anymore? How do I, one step up, one step back mode of just hanging on for dear life, and always having conversations about how great things could be. Imagine if we could, imagine if we could, imagine if we could. And a lot of the board meetings looking at that. The other kind of tack is taking a look at what was in the center. I grew up going to Impression 5, being a local boy, and now taking my three sons, I have twin 7-year-olds and a 10-year-old, taking them through the center. Much of the center's content was what I remember from elementary and middle school and growing up in this area. It had aged. And what it was teaching was very relevant, but how it was teaching struck me as not how kids learn. We just didn't know as much then as we do now about how kids learn, but that was the least of it. It was more how do you really engage kids in things that are less wordy and more doing.
So what you were beginning to talk about is there was kind of a product focus, that the product side had gotten a little aged.
I think so.
And the operational side needed some attention. So if we shift to the operational side for a minute, you recognized that one of the barriers to growth was the annual changing of the president's role, where you had a president coming in and out on an annual basis, which is very traditional for not-for-profits. Yet you began to see that having more stability at that position was going to be helpful. Can you talk to that, please?
Yeah, I think that stability is, I think it's extremely important when you change the mindset of what you're doing at a board. So, there's going to be a point in time at which I-5 is going to be repositioned to where maybe an annual changeover is going to be okay and should be okay. But when you go through, I think, an era of dramatic change, not incremental changes and little changes, because I think that there's a democraticness that lends itself to that, and a continual turnover of fresh blood and fresh ideas, if you will.
Which becomes healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're going through a dramatic change in mindset, in product, in deliverables, when you're going through a dramatic change like that, there has to be stability somewhere. And I think it's that stability of leadership, not only in the executive director, but also sort of the top end of the board. And because then you build a trusting relationship between the top end of the board and the top end of the staff. The bonds grow closer. How they can talk to one another and what they can feel safe talking to one another about grows a little bit closer. And I think the end product is that stability and leadership and mindset, both in staff and in the board, that allows for dramatic change without anybody fumbling the ball or without anybody halfway through dramatic change deciding that some other dramatic change is going to be better.
Right.
You remove ego from the process.
Well, and you have continuity of what your progress is going to be. So you mentioned that it was the stability of leadership at the board level that was able to own what was the next phase for the business.
Sure.
The stability of the president, and you suggested there were some other people at the board level that also were with you on that journey.
Plenty. Well, you're one of them.
Talk about that role that core group of people had in stabilizing the leadership at the board level.
So when you try to have conversations with an executive director, well, let me pause and kind of back up a little bit. Remember I mentioned a little bit ago about Impression 5 being in a survival mode, and realizing that we need to get our way out of survival mode and realize that we're not in survival mode. We didn't have to be in survival mode. Somebody somewhere decided that we were.
And we kind of got into that.
Right, and so the board meetings were a lot of dreaming. Which is fine for a board. A board needs to be able to dream. That's part of why you have a board of directors. But it's depressing when a lot of board we're doing this great thing, we're doing this great thing, we're doing this great thing, and then you have a 45-minute conversation where everything that comes out of somebody's mouth is, wouldn't it be great if? Let's stop talking about wouldn't it be great if, and let's just start doing some of that stuff.
Okay,
let's
sure.
just say no longer wouldn't it be great if, this is now underway. The other problem with that broader conversation is that's a lot of ideas. And so when you have when you're talking about reinvention and when you're talking about changing utterly changing the mindset of an organization and what it's delivering, when you have too many people involved in that conversation, it tends to fall apart, because then you have one idea moving down the track, and then you have a tangent, and then you have a tangent, and then pretty soon you have 50 tangents, and you've lost sight of where you were headed on that track, right? So when you can find a core group of volunteers on a board who are willing to A, stay involved, and B, give some extra time to develop a relationship with an executive director, then it's the same sort of thing that I mentioned a minute ago about the continuity of leadership at the very top. You develop a good relationship, you develop a good rapport, and you start to trust one another in terms of the information and in terms of what the tasks are. Why did we choose to do that? Because we had an executive director who quite frankly said, help me, let's get out of this. Let's work together and get me out of this mode. And I need to know what an executive director looks like who is not in a mode where, oh, dear God, please don't fall down the cliff. And so when you have this core group of volunteers who can then sit down with that executive director and act as a mentor, and that's exactly what this group is a mentorship group. Two things happen. One, you develop an executive director from the ground up, redevelop an executive director from the ground up. Here are the things you should be focusing on. You need to be looking at staff. Are you getting what you're paying for? Are you getting as much as what you're paying for? You need to start looking at your product. Who are you selling it to, and how do we, who do you have that can help you develop your product? Who do you have that can help you develop your marketing? So you build that from the ground up. How do you build a leader who isn't just trying to keep a place from surviving anymore from the ground up? And that's what that sort of core is. But then that group, when you've had those conversations and it's time to go back to the board of directors at our quarterly board meetings, then instead of just being a report from the executive director and staff about how sunny things look, followed by a thumbs up from the rest of the board, instead what you get are meaty conversations about what really is going on. What are our trends? What's going on with our deliverables? What's going on with our product? Exactly how are we involved in growing? What are the things, and what track are we on for the future for fundraising and product delivery and expansion? So in other words, what is our vision? But that has been born of a conversation, a deep conversation, and extra time between an executive director and this small core group of volunteers, our executive committee as we call it. Then the board of directors, besides for having meatier conversations and more engaging conversations at a board meeting, also get the sense that this is no longer just a rubber stamp, that there has been something that has been built, and thus they feel more compelled to buy in because it's not just the executive director pulling something out of the air and saying, I've thought of this new idea, but instead is also born of volunteers being the driving force really behind a nonprofit. I mean, that's Nonprofit 101.
So you have redefined for this business how the board and how it interacts with itself in order to be a supporting member of a reinvention process. At the same time, you also indicated that you had noticed a change from the executive, that the executive now was interested in leading into the next phase, right, but did not know how.
Right.
So how did you see the executives starting to position themselves to be open to the kinds of things that you were describing you were building on the political side, on the board side, so you could put those two things together? Because my sense is you need to have both of those things firing off at the same time.
You do. I mean, you have to have a willing board and a board that is full of people with not just good connections, because I think that a mistake that some boards make, and some boards that I've been involved with make, are, well, this guy's got good connections, let's get them on the board, because we're just going to mine all of our board members for their contacts and their contacts
It's
money.
just a contact list.
Huge,
here.
yeah. It's a walking, breathing Rolodex, and I think that's a huge mistake. You want people who are connected. You certainly do. You want people with extensive contact lists, because that's how you're going to grow your board. But the focus isn't in mining those people for that information. The focus should be on, as you're developing a board that's open to ideas like this, that people with good connections like that are typically driven people, and are typically people who they make a lot of friends on purpose. You know what I mean?
So around the table, it becomes an expectation that we have to start growing the business.
Sure, because that's how you develop subcommittees on your board. That's how you get extra people involved, so that as board members have to fall off or need to fall off, you have a go-to source of other well-connected people. Type A's hang out with Type A's, right?
Yeah. Who are willing to take ownership and are willing to drive their own initiatives to the benefit of the. But the executive, Noah, has to be able to buy into that.
Well, they do, and so you build the board one way, right? And so we started, as you remember from what we were doing on the board, we started reaching out to people who just who wanted to be involved, who had fresh ideas, who were involved in interesting careers and varied organizations that could give us glimpses to not only other organizations to get involved with I-5, but who by their very nature are just the type of driven people you need, who are going to be open for big change. But the other side of that, the other side of the same coin is an executive director is willing to do it, to kind of bring this back to your question, right? And so an executive director, a board that sees their executive director, well, let me put it this way. An aggressive board who is building itself and staffing itself, volunteering itself, full of very driven people, are going to notice very quickly that the center isn't what it needs to be, or their nonprofit isn't what it needs to be. That hidden under the veil of everything is great and we're doing all these wonderful things is this, hey, I've noticed our budget hasn't really changed, and hey, we keep fundraising the same amount of money year by year. So an engaged board starts asking those questions, and the moment you start to dig deep is the moment you look at your executive director and say, come on, man, what's really going on here?
Right.
And that's the moment that an honest one, and I love Eric to pieces, deeply with my whole heart. I think that he is one of the best human beings on the planet, with relief looks at you and says, I thought you'd never ask.
So in other words, you're saying he needed their engagement.
So the snake eating its tail, right? The snake eating its tail, okay? So what you had before was an executive director who thought his job was to tell the board that everything is great, and so the board would rubber stamp everything he was doing, so that he knew he was doing the right thing, so that he could tell the board that he was doing the right thing, so the board would tell him that he was doing the right thing. The snake eats its tail.
Yeah.
And so finally, when a board starts to ask real questions about what's,
what do the trends look like? What are you forecasting?
Was never in trouble. It was, in fact, the whole reason we got to where we were, like I said earlier in the interview, was because we got ourselves out of trouble.
Right.
Once you get yourself out of trouble, then you have to move on to the next phase of what's the next bigger, better thing. Whereas, we got stuck in, we're no longer in trouble. Thank God we saved the center. Now let's kind of go along.
And Eric was ready.
He was absolutely ready, but it just took someone, because, that's a lot of courage on a lot of people to engage in what I perceive that I-5 is engaged in. Eric is working his tail off on some very risky things. Tearing down the inside of your center and redoing 100% of your exhibit space and knocking down walls and putting up brand new walls, not just spray painting old stuff, but building things from the ground up, metaphorically as well as actually.
Completely reinventing.
That takes guts and a lot of risk, and a lot of Eric and his amazing personality convincing people in the Lansing area that this is not a dangerous investment. And by God, he did it. But it's because we had a board behind him who was willing to say, yeah, this is great, and we have to do this, we have to do this.
What that executive needed was that support from the board. Not judgment of thumbs up or thumbs down and you're on your own.
He wanted support
but
for growth.
Support for strategically moving
He wanted support for
in
growth.
this new direction.
Without
Now that
doubt.
means then that executive is going to start doing different things
behaving differently.
than what they were doing before. So what kinds of things as the president do you then expect this executive to be doing as opposed to what they might have been doing before?
Instead of trying to build a board that was going to create a bunch of committees that were going to supplant what Eric and his staff should be doing, some of board development, remember we are seeking board members who are aggressive and ask these tough questions and are, fresh, et cetera, et cetera.
Growing themselves.
But I, looking at it, we sort of intuited that building a board, and trying to put in these committees to supplant, like I said a second ago, what Eric and his staff ought to be doing would be to instead shift the focus to Eric and say, let's talk about what it is to build you and what it is to build your staff around something that a board can support instead of supplanting. And so, we were able to, with Eric and this small group of us, this executive committee, really start to dig deep into, let's talk about your fundraising. The board has been asking for years, well, what are our goals? What are our goals? Well, should the board set those goals? Well, I don't know. Should the executive set those goals? Well, since we're reinventing the executive, kind of yeah, because when you need Eric needs a job description, and Eric needs a way to know that he's doing the job that he's supposed to be doing. So let's build that job from the ground up. Let's give you a fundraising goal. Let's give you a staffing goal. Let's give you a product goal. Let's give you an outreach goal.
And we'll give you a chance to be the first one to define what those goals and what that job description should look like for where we're going, as opposed to us doing it from our vantage point. And that's a whole different process, because typically we do it outside of the individual and give it to the individual and say, this is what you should be doing. In this particular case, you were very adamant that the individual had to be directing their own future.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the result is we're now looking at, a 3 to 5 year plan of what we want our fundraising to look like. And then that has led to what Eric needs, an honest assessment of what Eric is missing on his staff so that he can get those folks in. And we have a timeline based for that. So we know exactly when they're supposed to be getting in. And then after after we've built those staffing needs, then we have some, outreach needs and some product needs. And so all of these needs, all of these things that we have, all these blanks we have to fill in, Eric knows what they are and has a timeline behind them. Voila. He now has a job description and something that the board can use to weigh how the executive director is doing in his job, rather than everything seems to be going great, Eric.
So the member engagement got redefined in terms of the product availability that the members could touch and feel and participate in. Right. The political side of the business was reinvented. In other words, the way the board operated and what its expectations were. What else is now out there for, in this particular case, a not-for-profit to consider if you've refreshed your reason for people participating with the business? You've refreshed politically the board side, so now the expectation at the board level is where it needs to be. You have refreshed your executive and what their expectations for what their deliverables are. How do you take all of that and then encourage that going forward?
I think now, so we're in the era where we have a real job description for him and a way that the board can actually have an honest assessment, other than his amazing personality, of where our executive director is at and where the center is going and what our goals should be. Great. Now we can start to focus on board. So now is the time when, let's kind of take a look at the board and who is on the board and what assets we have on the board and what should we be doing with it. Having rigidity on a board of, this is the marketing committee and this is what it does.
Right, which is traditionally what happens.
This is the fundraising committee and this is what it does. That type of rigidity on a board, I think, would then stagnate growth and the types of people who you could get on a board and the type of engagement they want. But so I think there's another point that we should touch on when you look at having a nimble board and a nimble executive. I think you have to look at what the marketplace is doing. Marketplaces are always nimble, right? We're, thank heavens, in a capitalist economy, and that depends on nimbleness. And so part of that is taking a quick look at where you fit in the marketplace. So I think that part of what sort of drove this success was where the marketplace is at. You have a governor who is hot on STEM. You have a marketplace who's hot on STEM. You have a government and a marketplace that is rejecting the old post-World War II notions of how to educate a kid, is instead looking at how to inspire a kid, and it's all focused on STEM. And so I-5 was able to say, hey, we're a science center. We teach kids STEM, but then we had to keep up with our brag, right? We had to keep up with the fact that we said that we teach kids STEM by then taking a look at how we teach that to kids and make sure that we're doing it in the right way. And so that we're developing a product that teaches STEM the way that kids want to be taught it. And then that kind of comes back into the whole conversation. How do we fit into the marketplace? How do we have an executive director that continually makes an assessment of how you fit into a marketplace that changes all the time? And how do you keep up with it? How do you have a board that keeps up with it?
Yeah, no, what's really interesting in listening to you talk about this is we don't just reinvent the business and then stop. Mm-hmm. What I'm hearing you say is there's a schedule for the member engagement side, so we're constantly refreshing why people are becoming involved with the Science Center, what the exhibits are, and so forth. But it's a very purposeful refresh. Yeah. That businesses need to constantly be refreshing why people are involved.
Right.
There's a purposeful refresh politically that you can't allow the function of a committee or the board to be stagnant. It should be constantly evolving and changing based on the needs in the marketplace. And the same with the executive, that if all three of these things, the executive and the board and the member engagement, are all kind of moving and finding its way to maximize its deliverables, each one pushes the other. So if the board isn't keeping up, that will be what holds the business and the executive back. If the executive is holding up, I mean, you've got to have all three of those kind of all moving ahead and all challenging each other.
Right. So now as the executive puts the right kind of staffers in place, the board is going to have a better idea about what our board committee should look like to be nimble with those staffers and provide the support that those staffers need without ever supplanting. You cannot supplant. The board cannot be in a position where it is doing for the executive and his or her staff what they should be doing. Instead, that pressure needs to be back on the executive to get the right staffers back in place. You can't expect a group of volunteers to run your nonprofit. It's insane.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
You know, we talked about the great opportunities that Noah taught us about asking in the beginning before his interview. So I hope you were really listening for those as you listened. I'd like to tie it to the first thing he said was when he ran into Eric, he just said, hey, I'd like to be on the board. If you have any opportunities for, openings for board members, just let me know.
Isn't that absolutely amazing, Misty, that really what in many cases it comes down to, success comes down to, is just asking. And Noah is so right in that no matter whether you're asking to be on the board, whether you're asking people to perform certain roles on the board, whether you're asking the executive to take on certain new roles, Noah really has been able to very simply understand the role of it's an important role, that role of ask, that role of knowing what you want. And how many people are looking for, just tell me what you want.
And I think, I can't remember exactly the story he told, but it was moving forward with his board role. And all of a sudden they looked at Eric and said, what do you need? It's some of the most obvious stuff, and sometimes that's why we miss it. But it's that art of asking.
Yes, and let's go back to that other thing that Noah talked about, which is the board sometimes just gets into this role of rubber stamping. They go through the agenda, and they meet for a couple hours a month or a couple hours a quarter. They go through their agenda, done,
all
bobblehead, as you so appropriately said. And instead of asking themselves, what's the role of the board in overseeing the journey of the business and the success of the business. Once Noah started to get that understanding built into the board, then all of a sudden the board was like, well, wait a minute, maybe we should ask the executive what the executive needs. And so then now you've got the executive asking for things from the board. You've got the board asking of things from the executive. Now we've created this thing called the law of expectation. And now we start to perform and do things because, Misty, you expect that from me. Mm-hmm. And it's so powerful.
And that goes to another point that Noah said that was so striking to me was when they were recruiting board members, they didn't just recruit based on contacts. they recruited based on the board's ability to develop ideas and what they could bring to the table. And that was my like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad he brought that up.
I think Noah has really been able to help me understand how boards need to move away from recruiting warm bodies and starting to recruit people who actually can perform an important role.
And that's so important in this theory of reinvention and sustainable change, is having the people there that aren't just kind of one-hit wonders. They're able to go on that journey with you and look for what's next and bring new ideas to the table because they're willing to explore them.
Yes, and I think, Misty, it's at that point when you have the executive owning, right, step 2 in the reinvention process, the executive owning their role in the journey, and then the board, instead of being this brainstorming group or this rubber stamping group or whatever it is that boards tend to do, the boards simply begin to say, what is our role? What is my role? What do I own in this space? What can I bring of value to enhance this journey? Not just kind of throw up a lot of stuff.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Noah introduced us to this idea of the board as a dreamer versus the board as a doer. And starting out, it was imagine if we could only, oh my gosh, to how can we?
That is so right. The tendency of boards is I wish we could do this and I wish we could do that. And when are we going to do this? And when are we going to do that?
We hear it all the time.
And the executive sits in that spot knowing full well what the realities of the business are and knows full well that there's a disconnect between the I wish we could do this and I wish we could do this and what about this and what about that. And there's really no place where the executive can put any of that stuff. So for there all of a sudden to be a whole different relationship where the executive is delivering the next level and the board is asking the executive, what do you need from us? What kind of capital do you need? What kind of time do you need? What kind of expertise do you need? What can we bring that will add to that journey that executive is initiating is so completely different. And Misty, I've got to tell you, it's so refreshing when you're a board member and you understand that's the important next step. And you see it start to happen.
Noah said rigidity stifles a board, but I think that you could expand that onto anyone or an organization, an executive director, a staff member, anything. Rigidity stifles the creation.
I think one of the things that I've begun to recognize more and more and more in this reinvention space, Misty, is the importance of fluidity. I've been hearing it many times that the one of the most important characteristics that will cause new people to engage and own, right, in this new space, is if they detect there's the ability for there to be fluidity. In other words, we're not going to keep doing what we've always done. But if you're open to creating a fluid state of change, where that fluid state of change allows us to discover and begin to implement these new ideas, and along the way continually change and improve upon what we're doing, then I'm in. And that attracts a completely different group of people who are absolutely incredibly important to the success of the next phase of your journey.
And those people are really so exciting and what makes pure reinvention happen.
So if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter @Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.